other than like.
Okay, so we can start, I think. I'm Victor. I'm a pre-doc, post-bac here, for those of you who don't know. And I'm excited to talk about this today. So I'm going to talk about the evolution of cooperation when we only have partial information about each other. And we don't know necessarily who's cooperating, who's not, and stuff like that. Yeah, so first I want to just kind of define what cooperative behaviors are. So I just mean a behavior that produces an aggregate benefit to society. So that's, preserving the commons, contributing to public goods, providing external benefits to the community. So maybe not a garden like that in Santa Fe. And also, fostering trust, maybe telling the truth online or something like this. But cooperative behaviors can be costly. But fortunately, society has a whole mesh of mechanisms that try to encourage us to be cooperative. And these include laws, economic incentives, and social pressures. The thing with laws and economic incentives is that they often involve a centralized body that maybe knows some information about us and doles out rewards and punishments. They're kind of coarse mechanisms. So social pressures kind of fill that gap nicely. The agents of social pressure are people in my network. And so they know things about me that the government doesn't. Maybe the government knows things about me that they don't, but they're complementary in that way. So I'm going to focus on social pressures today, but in a sort of broadly construed way. I'm defining social pressures as the encouragement of particular behaviors through social interactions. And that can be individual level social interactions. So, I shame you for posting something sexist online or whatever. Or it could be more structural types of things. Like, you might act very differently in a small town versus a big city because the social network structure is kind of different. And maybe you think that stuff you do is gonna percolate to people who you care about more than in a big city, for example. And so social pressures requires, especially on the individual level, they require kind of two things. One is information about what people are doing. If I want to pressure someone to do something, it helps if I know what they're up to. And also kind of a depth of interaction. If I want to impose a cost on somebody for doing something that I don't appreciate, they need to care enough about me. We need to interact enough that I can do that effectively. But the problem is, in our world, there's less and less of this, especially with online things. We have so many, a huge volume of connections online. We know a little bit about a lot of people. We don't have a lot of depth of interaction with people online. And especially because, these relationships are often quite ephemeral. I posted something on Reddit. I talked to someone once in my life and then never again. These types of interactions lack that kind of depth that is necessary for social pressure. And there's also an element of anonymity online. Maybe Facebook knows everything about me, but on a peer-to-peer level, we can hide behind the anonymity. So, sorry, that's the end of this talk, photo portion of the talk. But I want to ask, yes?
No, go ahead.
Okay. So I want to ask, how do we get cooperation in such a world? And specifically, what mechanisms can lead to cooperation when we only have partial information about each other? So before I start, I want to thank a few people. First, Melanie, for just being a wonderful mentor to me throughout this year. I've had a really great year. I've worked on really interesting things. And Melanie is the one who guided me through it all and made it all possible. So thank you, Melanie. And I also want to thank the co-authors on the work that I'm talking about today. That's Mike Price, Diana Smirnova, who's a peer of mine, and my undergrad advisor, Shimon Edelman. And also Tyler, Elena, John, Hajime, and Arseny for their feedback and ideas throughout my work on this stuff. Okay, so as an outline, you guys might have seen the abstract. I had to cut it down a lot. Maybe those more experienced than me were like, there's no way he's gonna be able to talk about all this, and you would have been right. So this is what I'm going to talk about. I'm going to define cooperation. I'm going to talk about what I mean by partial information. And I'm going to identify some candidate mechanisms that might be useful for producing cooperation and partial information. Then I'm going to talk about the no visibility case. That's the case when potentially nobody is observing a particular action. And I'm going to talk about how conscience, not consciousness, I don't want to open that can of worms, but conscience, which is the internalization of norms, might be a useful mechanism here. I'm going to show how conscience can actually amplify group selection by sort of mitigating the weaknesses that it has. And then I'm going to do a brief discussion, talk about the implications of this for cultural evolution, and maybe some policy intuitions if I have time. They're a little bit unrigorous, so I don't know if this audience will appreciate it. Well, anyway, we'll see if I have time. So yes, cooperation and information. So what's cooperation? It's paying a private cost, C, for the benefit of someone else or society as a whole or something. And we'll say that B is greater than C. So there's this aggregate societal benefit to cooperating. And, you know, I said before cooperation was producing an aggregate benefit. Why am I adding this cost? Well, cooperation isn't a huge puzzle if there's no individual cost. So I'm more interested in this case for the talk. And so, you know, in a multiplayer setting, this leads to something called a public goods game, where you have a public pot, you have a bunch of agents, and you know, each agent can decide whether or not to pay a cost to contribute to the public pot, and their contribution to the public pot is more than the cost that they paid. All right, so that's cooperation. The thing is, the best strategy here is to free ride, because if you don't pay the cost to contribute to the public pot, you know, sorry, I don't know if I mentioned, the public pot then gets divided evenly among the group. So if you don't contribute, your share is only going to marginally decrease, but you save on the whole cost. So you kind of want to not contribute. And so, well, that's going to be, I'm going to talk about mechanisms that get people cooperating in this type of setting. I just also want to say the two-player case of this is a prisoner's dilemma. You have two people and they can each decide to pay a cost to contribute a benefit to somebody else. All right, so that's cooperation. What's partial information? Well, I'm going to talk about it in terms of levels of visibility. So I'm going to mention two. One is low visibility. So, you know, very few people observe a given interaction, but some people do. So here lilac is observing purple. And then sometimes there's, you know, no one's observing, and that's the no visibility case. I'm going to focus more on this second case today. Sorry, I'm pointing at that. Yeah, I'm going to focus more on that no visibility today. Right. So what are the mechanisms that could lead to the evolution of cooperation? There are many, many proposed mechanisms, but they all kind of share a basic principle, which is this principle of biased allocation. And the way that works is if you have a public pot and you have a cooperator and a defector, the cooperator is going to contribute to the public pot and the defector is not. And then, you know, the public pot, there's a, you know, the benefit is some multiplier times the cost that was paid. I said B is greater than C, so that multiplier is greater than 1. And then the benefits get distributed to the rest of the group. And the idea behind pretty much every mechanism for the evolution of cooperation is that somehow the cooperators get a bigger share of the benefits than the defectors, through some way or another. And so in general, if I want to say that the multiplier is M, and the bias towards the cooperator is P, well, we need P to be greater than M plus 1 over 2M, which means that if the multiplier is very large, 10, for example, then your bias needs to be 11 over 20, 55%, which is not very much above 50%. The mechanism doesn't need to do very much work. By contrast, if the multiplier is very small, like 2, you need a bias of 3/4. The benefit, the mechanism at play needs to do a whole lot more. And that's why basically the multiplier is the single most important factor in whether cooperation will evolve or not. And yeah, so now I'm going to talk about different mechanisms that do this in different ways. Okay, so for the low visibility case, well, you could imagine something called indirect reciprocity could work. The idea is that you cooperate with those who have cooperated with others. So if you have two players meeting in a prisoner's dilemma, circle cooperates, then circle meets pentagon later on. And pentagon may not have ever met circle before, it didn't observe the previous interaction, but square can signal to pentagon, hey, you know, circle cooperated, and then Pentagon can cooperate in response. So this implements the bias because those who cooperate get cooperated with. So that's a very simple way that it can work out. I also asked the question, what keeps gossip truthful? Sorry for this shameless plug. I wrote a paper with Mike about this, and I really wanted to talk about it today, but I don't think I'll have time. So if you want to check it out, it's on archive. But I'm going to talk about the mechanisms for no visibility today. So how would this look? Well, you know, on an individual level, none of those agents know what purple did. But on a group level, there is a trace of that action, which is that the group is better off as a whole. There's that action has produced an aggregate benefit to the group. So on the group level, there's some information here that was contributed. So what mechanism could work in this kind of context? Well, there's group selection, which is somewhat controversial, but I hope to address your concerns in the rest of this talk. And the idea is that groups with higher total fitness outcompete those with lower total fitness. And if you have a lot of cooperators, they're producing this aggregate benefit. Those groups are going to have higher total fitness compared to the defectors, the high defection groups that have lower total fitness. But you can also look at this another way. And you can look at it in terms of the biased allocation that I talked about earlier. And the biased allocation here, what's going on is, well, think about the probability of being in the high cooperation group. If you're a cooperator, you're much more likely to be in the high cooperation group than if you're a defector, because there's just more cooperators in the high cooperation group. So this is a purely structural property. No agent has to know anything about what anyone else is doing, and you still get the biased allocation. So this points to an important, that's what I just said. This points to an important distinction between types of information. The first is knowledge, where agents know things about each other, and then they can act differentially based on that knowledge. And then there's structure, which is the environment constrains agents' actions in particular ways, or there's statistical properties of the system, for example, that create this biased allocation without anyone having to know anything. So if we look at our levels of visibility, well, in the knowledge case, I gave an example of that indirect reciprocity, for example, for the low visibility. But in the no visibility, structure can work in the low visibility case because it doesn't care who knows what, I suppose. But in the no visibility case, knowledge is not going to work, and you need the structure. And so we're going to look at group selection for that reason for this case. So our plan is, I'm going to look at that corner of the grid. And so I'm going to talk about the no visibility context. I'm going to propose that group selection could be a candidate mechanism, but there's going to be a problem, which is that group selection is very weak. I'll try to describe why group selection is weak. The first is that it needs to fight against intra-group dynamics. So if you have a highly cooperative group competing with a highly uncooperative group, well, maybe the highly cooperative group will outcompete the highly uncooperative group, will replace that group, the defection group will die off. But within the group, the defectors do better than the cooperators because they're not paying the cost, they're getting the benefits from all these cooperators, they gradually infiltrate the group. So pretty soon these cooperative groups are not so cooperative anymore. So that's one thing. Group selection needs to fight against this dynamic. So it's under this kind of time pressure. And then there's another problem, which is that group selection relies on intergroup variance. In the high variance case versus the low variance case, well, a highly cooperative group will outcompete a highly uncooperative group more decisively than a kind of cooperative group will outcompete a kind of not cooperative group. You could also look at this in terms of biased allocation. In the high variance case, a cooperator is overwhelmingly likely to be in the highly cooperative group compared to the low variance case where they're only marginally more likely to be in the high cooperation group. And this problem is exacerbated with the size of groups increase because, due to the law of large numbers, small groups might vary more in terms of their percentage of cooperators compared to large groups. So large groups are a kind of double whammy because on the one hand, they're more anonymous often, they can decrease visibility, which is visibility is helpful for social pressure to actually work. And also there's less variance. And so group selection is also weakened. And so we kind of have this puzzle, like how are we going to address this? And I want to propose that a mechanism akin to conscience can help amplify group selection by addressing these two weaknesses. All right, so that's the introduction. Do people have questions?
I do have one.
Yes.
Which is a slightly counterintuitive second point you made about large groups, because it's true that they're less susceptible to stochastic fluctuations, but the variance that is encoded is meaningful variance. So this is very well known in population genetics. So large populations are much more useful in the deterministic regime. So
yeah, I think we'd have to talk more about this because I'd have to understand the point a little bit better to give a meaningful answer. But
right, it's just that the differences in large groups are real differences. Differences in small groups are not.
Real differences in the sense of
the proportions of cooperators versus defectors.
I see. So there's some kind of non-independence going on. Is that kind of what? Oh, whoops.
No, it's not non-independent. It's just a sort of sampling bias. It's just that root mean variance. It's just as you increase the population size, the differences that you observe converge on the true. It's like
I see what you mean.
They converge on the true ratio.
I see. Yes. So yeah, I guess here I was talking about assuming that the population mean that's being sampled from is the same for the large groups versus the non-large groups. But yes, maybe not. And so I think some of the things that I'll talk about might kind of go to this point later in the talk. But
before you're stopped, are they conditional cooperators? What are these cooperators?
Here they're just cooperators, but I'm going to introduce a new strategy that's kind of conditional, I guess, in a certain way. So this part of the talk is based on this work that I did with Diana and Shimon. And so, maybe the standard model of this group selection is that you have, and this is to your question, you have groups with unconditional cooperators and unconditional defectors. And then group selection is weak for the reasons that I described. But I want to introduce a new strategy that might, address this, which I'm calling conscience. And it's the tendency to internalize norms practiced by a community. So if you have a lot of cooperators in the group, then you internalize the norm. To cooperate, you become more cooperative. If there are a lot of defectors in the group, well, then you might internalize the norm to be selfish and defect more. And when I say internalize a norm, I mean to practice a behavior even when no one is watching. And so, in the unconditional cooperator case, you get cooperation in the no visibility case. Here you do too, as long as the conscience agents have have internalized the norm to cooperate. So I want to refine my question from before. What mechanisms can lead to cooperation when we only have partial information about each other? I'm going to ask, in a world with no visibility actions, is conscience better able to catalyze cooperation than unconditional cooperators? So does conscience somehow amplify group selection? And the model that I'm going to work with is, it's going to be a public goods game. So people in groups playing the public goods game. There's going to be the conscience strategy. So some agents are going to be internalizing the norms of the rest of the group. There's going to be observation and punishment. So with some probability, agents will be observed and potentially punished for not cooperating, but only some of the time, about 50% of the time. So a lot of the actions will go unobserved. And then there's going to be intergroup competition with a lot of groups playing this public goods game. I want to go a little bit more into detail on these two middle components. So the first one is conscience, which I described as this internalization of norms, but I do want to operationalize what it means when I say when no one is watching. And so that's the observation and punishment piece. So agents have, and they know their probability of being observed. And they're punished if they're caught defecting. And they're punished by not getting their share of the public pot. And so here, it's important to say that the defection isn't necessarily the expected value maximizing strategy. Because sometimes if you're very likely to be observed and there's a lot in the pot and you might be deprived of that, you might want to cooperate. And so we're going to introduce expected value maximizers as another strategy. And we're going to see how the conscience agents fare in this kind of world. Right, so this was the question. the experiments that we will run are, there's going to be two conditions. One condition where there's everyone's EV maximizer or defector besides, aside from 2% unconditional cooperators. And then the other case is that there's 2% constants and the remainder are defectors or EV maximizers. And so now I'm going to talk about how this can sort of address the weaknesses of group selection. So, well, the first thing is to say that the constants condition does lead to very significantly higher levels of cooperation. The teal box plots are the constants levels of cooperation. The red box plots are the unconditional cooperation case, where actually the unconditional cooperators kind of just died out. And you can see that the constants setting is much more effective at catalyzing this high level of cooperation. I'm sorry, the error bars are the min and max. Like the standard error bars are like really, really small. They are like 99%, like the confidence interval is 99%, I think. And so I'm going to talk about how constants does this in terms of the weaknesses of group selection. So first, the intergroup dynamics component, then the intergroup variation component. So what about, so the intergroup dynamics component actually has two pieces. The first piece is the proliferation when rare piece, which is, when cooperators are rare and they start cooperating in a group full of defectors, well, they're immediately going to do worse than everybody else, not get any benefits, and quickly die off. Then there's the persistence when common case, where a defector that shows up in a group where everyone's cooperating can free ride off of all of that cooperation, do better than everybody else, and infiltrate the group. And these sound kind of similar, but there's actually like a really important asymmetry between these two cases. A lot of strategies work really well in the proliferation when rare case and not well at all in the persistent when common case, or the other way around. For example, costly punishment, where the strategy is cooperators cooperate and they punish people that don't cooperate at a cost to themselves. So, what happens here is when there's a ton of defectors and very few cooperators, well, the cooperators have to punish all these defectors, and they don't share the burden with anybody else. So punishment is extremely costly when it's rare. When it's common, it's very cheap. There's very few defectors, a lot of people to share the burden of punishment, and so it becomes much less costly. So that's just an example of the asymmetry. I'm going to talk about how conscience deals with these two cases. So the proliferation when rare problem. Well, if you have a group of entirely defectors and a conscience agent shows up, well, they're not going to internalize the norm to cooperate. So they're going to start defecting like everybody else, and they're not going to do any worse than everybody else. And we kind of saw that in our results here. This is the population change of the conscience agents for different levels of cooperation. Each dot is a group, and they were at a certain level of cooperation. 20 rounds later, how did the conscience population change? You can see that for low levels of cooperation, the conscience agents are not at any disadvantage. They don't tend to increase or decrease. Yeah?
Can I ask you how you actually, you haven't said a word, as far as I've seen, about how you do the group dynamics, where the...
Sorry, yes,
So is a group replicating itself exactly, or...
We actually ran...
Is it replicating with some variance? Because I think if you replicate a small group, then you are likely in the next generation or the next round of the game to have much more variance. So...
Right, so the way that group selection worked is... it was kind of indirect intergroup competition. The way it worked is you had a bunch of groups, the cooperative and so essentially what happened is the rule was quite simple. The group can, agents could pay a cost if they can afford it to reproduce, and they also needed to pay a cost to survive to the next round. And so what you saw is that conscience groups, high cooperation groups had higher aggregate fitness. So agents could more often pay the cost to reproduce and pay the cost to survive. So these high cooperation groups grew in size. And eventually, what the rule that we set was once the group gets big enough, it splits. And so, one group kind of splits off into a new group. So that's how the group reproduction happens. Right, Right. Does that answer your question?
We're in a world where zero visibility, right?
So
Because I'm wondering about the nature of punishment. So right.
Yeah. So each agent has a probability of being observed, which is uniformly sampled from 0 to 1, and they know that probability. So like EV maximizers, for example, will never cooperate when they have like an extremely low probability of being observed. Conscience agents will. So the probability of being observed then determines like your chance of, sorry, this is obvious, your chance of being observed, which then determines like the people who are punished are those that are caught defecting.
Right.
So right. Does that answer your question?
It does, but so I thought we were in a world where there's zero visibility, and so I'm wondering like what you could do to punish other than withhold your own cooperation if you don't know who to punish.
Right. So I wasn't super clear about this. I said in a world where there are many no visibility actions. So here, half of all actions, because it's sampled from 0 to 1, uniformly from 0 to 1, go unobserved. So there's like a very significant portion of unobserved actions. You wouldn't expect, like an EV maximum, like, right, you wouldn't expect a cooperation rate much higher than 50% in this world, since only 50% of actions are observed. So yeah, that's kind of the situation.
Isn't conscience perfect visibility?
What do you mean?
Well, but how do I derive? Don't you just derive it from the mean of the population that surrounds you?
Yeah, so like your total, the general aggregate level of cooperation in your group, but you don't know who did what, basically.
But when you mathematically calculate it,
Mhm.
you're calculating average of all individuals, right? Your
Level of cooperation, yes.
Perfect knowledge.
So I guess I'm assuming knowledge of the group aggregate, but not knowledge of the individual.
What is that when you're in a group?
What is the group aggregate?
Yeah.
I guess it's, the overall, I guess the assumption is that people have a general sense of like, oh, this group is very cooperative, this group is not, because they can see whether, people are taking care of the public goods or
Right,
contributing to the commons, but they don't know who's doing what. They just know that it's happening. Yeah. So yes, there's no disadvantage to conscience when cooperation is low. Then there's the persistence when common case. And there's actually two things at play here. The first is the reward mechanism that I talked about before. In low cooperation groups, the pot is very empty. In high cooperation groups, the pot is very full. So getting deprived of your share of the pot in low cooperation groups is very, not that, it's not that scary of a proposition, while getting deprived of your share in the high cooperation groups is much more costly. And so this kind of helps cooperation to persist when it's common, because it becomes more costly not to cooperate when it's common. And we see this. So this is the graph that I showed a little bit earlier, except now I've added the purple box plots, which are the cooperation rates of the EV maximizers. Sorry, I'm blocking. The cooperation rates of the EV maximizers when they're in the conscience, like when they're in the conscience world, right? And you can see that the cooperation rates are very, very high. And that's because, it's much more costly not to cooperate in these worlds. So that's one thing, but that's not specific to conscience. That's specific to getting deprived of your benefits when you don't cooperate. So there is another mechanism that is specific to conscience for the persistence when common part, which is that when the group is highly cooperative, people are going to internalize the norm to cooperate. The group is going to become even more cooperative. So the conscience agent internalizes that cooperation norm, then the group becomes more cooperative. And so we can see this in the transition probabilities between low and high cooperation states. For high conscience, 99.9% of the time, high cooperation groups stay high cooperation, while for low conscience groups, it's only 91.7% of the time. This is after 20 rounds. And so, conscience does a lot to help cooperation persist when it's common. But there is still, this is, from what I've described so far, you might think, oh, well, just based on intra-group dynamics alone, maybe conscience can catalyze cooperation. It's not entirely true, because there is a broader negative feedback loop at play here, which is, I just said that high conscience can lead to higher levels of cooperation, or at least preserve high levels of cooperation. But when cooperation levels are high, there's a fall in the population of conscience. And you can see that that's the dip there in this graph, that when cooperation levels are high, conscience agents internalize the norm to cooperate, they pay the cost of cooperating, and then free riders can start doing better. The reason it kind of spikes back up to 0 way at the end is because way at the end, there's very, very few or no free riders, so the conscience agents aren't at any disadvantage once you get to like 100% cooperation. But before that, there's this fall in conscience occurring. So group selection is still necessary to, it's still necessary because overall the intergroup dynamics do lead to this fall in cooperation, but conscience makes the intergroup dynamics much more favorable to having high levels of cooperation. Okay, so that was the intergroup dynamics part. Then there's the intergroup variance part. So how does conscience address this? Well, conscience is kind of like conformist transmission, right? It's a subtype of conformist transmission, you can say. And so the positive feedback loop of conscience that extremifies the groups when they're highly cooperative leads to a polarization of groups. So this is the prevalence of conscience and the cooperation percentage of those groups. And you can see that as conscience increases, yes, the cooperation percentage increases, but groups also get more extreme. They polarize to the extremes. And so this, creates the kind of intergroup variance that group selection relies on. And this is something that people have observed about conformist transmission in groups, how it, is Henrik? Yeah, so Henrik talked about that. But what's important here is that there's a kind of interesting positive feedback where, conscience magnifies these intergroup differences, which strengthens group selection, and then group selection selects for the more cooperative groups, which tend to have a higher level of conscience. So you have this nice positive feedback loop.
What does the high conscience, low cooperation group look like?
High conscience, because are you looking at the
In the last plot, yeah.
Yeah, so this can happen a few ways. In a few ways, groups die off in like slowly, and sometimes there's like only 1 or 2 agents left or something like that. Maybe by chance that group is a conscience agent. Sorry, that the 1 agent left over is a conscience agent. So you have 100% conscience group that maybe, but before they didn't internalize the norm to cooperate because that was a high defection group before it died off. And then the conscience agent happened to be the only one left over. So you can see something like that. That's generally how it happens. That's why there was that dip at the end there. Okay, so let's see. Oh.
I mean, what you call conscience is a kind of mean field version of what other people call the effect of space or repeated interaction. Because you're just, exactly the same result is very well known for repeated interaction. Spatial effects.
Right.
So you're just saying you'll take some kind of mean field of that so that I get to some population, right? But it's exactly the same result as the spatial model.
Oh, I guess I hadn't thought about it that way, but yeah, that's a good point. Yes.
Is it the case that you allow individuals to vary the level of consciousnness? And if not, what would they evolve to have?
What do you mean by varying the level of how extreme you are internalizing the norm? We don't. There's a few things about conscience that you could vary. One is, so the way it works is if the group is above, there's this parameter called the propensity to cooperate. And if your propensity to cooperate is 0, you act like an AV maximizer. If it's 1, you cooperate all the time. And if the group cooperation level is above 50%, you move towards 1. If it's not, you move towards 0. So we could have, first of all, adjusted the threshold. It could have been 30% or something like that, something lower, which I'm actually curious to explore this, and I haven't yet. So in that case, it's not really conformist transmission because there's this bias towards cooperation. And that would potentially lead to groups starting to cooperate faster because the threshold is lower, but it also leads to that dip in conscience fitness earlier on. So there, I'd have to think about like what the optimal threshold would be. It would be interesting to know. And then also you could also think about, well, maybe some agents internalize the norm faster. So there's like a learning rate, right? That you have. And yeah, we didn't adjust that, but I think it could be interesting to look at.
I meant not adjusting it, let it evolve.
Oh, right. Yes. Yeah, we could. No, that's an interesting question. Yeah. So now I want to talk about, do a little brief discussion. I guess we have some time. So do people have questions? Other questions? Yeah.
Just a bigger question. So, I've worked a lot with Joe Henrik and Odouard Zion on these group cooperation problems, and we've argued that certain types of religious belief and practice can help.
Mhm.
One proposed mechanism we had was the internalization of norms, but the other was at least one other one is just eliminating or reducing no visibility situations
Mhm.
by introducing belief in supernatural beings who can see you when you're living.
I see. Yeah.
So have you played around with just what about a group that can actually reduce the no visibility or eliminate no visibility situations?
That's interesting. I mean, at the level of abstraction of this model, right? I mean, you could think of, maybe the conscience agents think that they're being observed, like there's nothing, that, an agent that believes it's being observed by some supernatural power versus an agent that just internalizes a norm and has some kind of internal moral compass or whatever is sort of indistinguishable in this context. But yeah, no, I think these like religious mechanisms are really fascinating, and they also introduce like more richness than just like the cooperate defect dichotomy. So no, yeah.
Well, it's not indistinguishable, right? Because the case of internalization of norms depends on your observation of other people's behaviors, where the supernatural doesn't rely on observations of others.
Yeah, I guess you would assume that probably in the group, well, this is speculation, but yeah, you'd assume that probably in the group where you start believing in a supernatural power, you do it because other people also believe in that power. So you are internalizing something from other people. But yeah, so, okay, so, is something not, oh, there, okay, cool. So now I'll talk about some cultural evolution implications. So first I want to talk about conformist transmission. So conscience is like kind of a type of conformist transmission, you can say. I mean, if you modify the threshold to be something like 30%, then it's no longer really conformist transmission because you can still internalize a rarer behavior. But in our model it was. And so the classic explanation for conformist transmission is that the group has the best information about what beneficial behaviors are. So, if you are an individual, you're sampling information from the environment about what the environmental state is, there's going to be a lot of variance because you don't take that many samples, while the group average opinion on what the state of the environment is will come from a lot more samples. So as an individual, you're better off just copying the group than thinking for yourself. So the group information is a better cue for individually beneficial actions. And so, this theory is basically, so if I draw out a matrix of like individually beneficial versus harmful actions, and then group beneficial versus harmful actions, you get mutualism when both benefit, you get cooperation when the group benefits and the individual pays a cost. You get free riding and when the group is harmed and the individual benefits, and you get just harmful practices in the bottom right. And so this explanation of conformist transmission, basically explains the left side of this matrix. It says, we have an evolutionary explanation for the left side, and so why would people copy cooperative behaviors or harmful behaviors? Well, there's probably some kind of exaptation process going on, where exaptation is, when a mechanism is used for something it didn't originally evolve to be used for, and the idea is, well, people can't distinguish between the left side and the right side, so they just copy everything or something. But I think that's plausible for certain scenarios, especially in like the complex world and stuff like that. But I do think that sometimes cooperation is just clearly costly. It requires a time commitment or a risk to oneself, or something like that. So it's not always super convincing. And so what I tried to do here was provide an explanation for why people would copy cooperative behaviors through this, positive feedback between conscience and group selection. And then the idea is, well, now you only have to explain one cell of the matrix through exaptation. And this pathway makes a lot of sense, in my opinion, because, on a local level, cooperative behaviors and harmful practices don't look that different. They're both harmful to the individual. An individual might have very noisy information about what's benefiting the group or not, like how their individual actions are benefiting or not benefiting the group. So, it makes sense that an agent might not be able to distinguish between those two cases. And so, this is maybe an alternative way of filling out this imitation matrix that I laid out here. Okay, well, it looks like I have some time. So now I want to talk about, this research that I presented is obviously very abstract. It's not going to give specific, policy recommendations or whatever for specific systems, but I think it can provide some intuition about the kinds of mechanisms that might be required for getting cooperation in these kinds of low visibility types of environments. And so I want to kind of summarize those intuitions. Obviously, so it's kind of like a guide to the search space of possible possibilities, right? Certain things have promise, and obviously they would need to be studied in more detail. But the first thing I want to say is, group selection is good for low visibility scenarios because it relies on this group level knowledge rather than individual level knowledge. But group selection in the real world, it's not clear how to get those types of forces going on, often because it involves groups dying off and things. So online, in the online world, that could make perfect sense. But you also have analogs of group selection in the world that basically sort of operate on similar types of principles. So one example is voting with your feet. If people have freedom to move, they can move to groups that are doing better than other groups. Those groups will grow, their practices, will proliferate more. And this works well in the low information about each other case, because yes, to vote with your feet, you need to have knowledge about the group aggregate state, but you don't need to know about specific individual level details. And the other thing is prestige biased imitation on a group level. So if one group is doing very well, another group might try to imitate that group's policies or something like that. And similarly to group selection, these mechanisms rely on heterogeneity between groups. In our world currently, heterogeneity is kind of a dying thing for a lot of reasons. There's globalization, there's network effects with social networks where we all benefit from being on the same social network. So we don't get that kind of, people can't vote with their feet and go to a different social network, for example, because, there is no other social network that's actually a viable one to join. And so, we have to think about how we might respond to such network effects. And I want to point out two ways we might do this. The first is avoiding unnecessary coordination. My favorite example of this, not to be someone who thinks that Canada is heaven on earth or whatever, but I think this is a really nice example. So the US has district elections and they have national elections. And naturally in a majoritarian democracy, it's going to gravitate to a two-party equilibrium. The thing with the US is because the district elections and the national elections are happening at the same time, there's this pull for the districts to be pulled to the same two-party equilibrium as the national elections. So you get the same two-party equilibrium everywhere in the country. While in Canada, there is no federal election. People elect their members of parliament at the level of the riding, that's a district. And so you can get different two-party equilibria in different districts across Canada. And so that's a really interesting case of avoiding unnecessary coordination between different parts of the country in this case. But you can also think about this in terms of social networks. So we're all on Facebook or whatever, maybe not. But we're all on the same social networks because we benefit from all being connected to each other. But we don't necessarily all benefit from using the same algorithm to serve us material. That's just a byproduct of us all being on the same social network. So the algorithm, the fact that we all are using the Facebook algorithm to serve us information is an example of unnecessary coordination. You could imagine, everybody, decides on using a different algorithm to serve them information. And so, obviously because of the structure of the way things are, this may be unnecessary coordination, but it's very hard to change. But I do want to point out that this unnecessary coordination happens in a lot of places. And then the other thing is just allocating power to local groups as much as possible. This also helps to foster heterogeneity. Great example is Reddit. On Reddit, they allow different subreddits to have different sets of policies, and people can, choose what subreddit to join. Obviously, Reddit could go a lot further. There are certain things that are the same across Reddit, but that would also help to foster a good degree of heterogeneity. Was there a question? And then finally, I want to point out for a mechanism designer, or highlight this rare versus common distinction, that very often very different kinds of mechanisms are required for the proliferation when rare side and the persistence when common side. And if you want a robust set of mechanisms, it's good to think about both cases and have mechanisms in place for both types of situations. And so, as an example, we said in the conscience groups, the proliferation when rare scenario, well, the conscience agents were able to proliferate when rare because they didn't cooperate when they were rare. But you can imagine another kind of, mechanism for the rare case. For example, you could actively coordinate those that are willing to cooperate, bring them together and have them benefit from each other's behavior. I think a really nice example of this is Josh Garland and Mirta's paper about hate counter speech and the fact that people do a lot. It's much more effective when people do this in groups because they sort of provide some protection for each other and some shield. So great example of proliferation when rare type of mechanism. For persistence when common, nice ones are, these types of ostracism type, that sounds bad, types of policies, but basically the types of policies that deprive you of the group benefit when you don't contribute. Well, those work really well when the group's doing really well, because you have access to all those benefits, but maybe not so well when the behavior is very rare. So that basically concludes what I wanted to talk about. I'm actually really surprised that I got through it. I'll just summarize and then I can take your question. So first in the first section, I said group selection is a great mechanism for the no visibility cases. Then I talked about how conscience could amplify group selection by not being at a disadvantage when it's rare, by being self-perpetuating when it's common, and by creating these intergroup differences between groups. And finally, I talked about a little bit about how this sort of maybe helps think about certain conformism in certain types of cases, especially the cooperation case. And I gave some rough policy intuitions. So that's it. Thanks, you guys have been a great audience. Yes.
So in your last slide with this policy intuition, when you say like active coordination, or that's what you call it.
Yeah.
You seem to form smaller groups.
Because you can take disparate people that are far off from each other, not interacting with each other, and connect them together, so that it becomes the equivalent of a high cooperation group, for example, by bringing.
It's like almost a mechanism to say like, okay, let's split the group into cooperators and defectors.
Right. Yeah.
So,
and this is like often, there's this mechanism that people sometimes call assortativity, where cooperators start to you know, preferentially interact with each other and stuff like that. Obviously, so that specific mechanism requires, you know, individual level knowledge, right? And so that's not a low visibility or no visibility case. That was just a nice example of a proliferation when rare type of policy.
Yeah, but
Yes.
it's like, I feel it's a little bit like, it's strange because you say, you know, it's a mechanism for when rare. Well, let's just do away with the rare by just getting together with the ones that do cooperate, and then they are not rare anymore.
Yeah, that's fair enough. I mean, but it's you know, it's eliminating the rarity by like creating concentrated pockets of agents that are still rare on the whole, but because you have this concentrated pocket, you know, they can sort of benefit from each other's behavior. Yeah.
So I just want to build on that point, because can't that also go either way? And what I mean is like QAnon, flat earthism, Jan 6 are rare groups able to find each other in this new world, this new network world, and build cooperation momentum for the detriment of the group, you know. So how do you decide which times that's happening for the broader benefit of society and which times it's happening for extreme detriment?
Yeah, so I mean, this is, so, you know, heterogeneity is dangerous. You know, a lot of, can be dangerous. A lot of people, you know, you can imagine like very extreme places where people like will implement very extreme types of policies. You can, you know, and then, you know, voting with your feet, then people can sort themselves into extreme types of environments and things like that. So this is totally non-rigorous, what I'm about to say. My take on this is that polarization happens in the ideas realm. And so it happens when there's no connection with reality. People can think whatever they want and not have that grounded in reality. And so I think what would do a lot actually to mitigate polarization is to let people implement the policies. You know, it's a crisis of agency. People can't do anything, so that they think crazy things. And they don't get any feedback on those things that they think because they can't implement them. And so my take is let people, trust people to, you know, run their communities and provide that feedback that they can implement something, see what happens. And I think that's, you know, that's my opinion. You know, there's dangers. And on certain things, maybe you want to say, you know, like no violations of human rights, that type of thing, right? In any community. But I think the nice thing about this empowering heterogeneity type of thing is that it provides the feedback necessary to sort of mitigate crazy views.
So your group selection here would be people do get together for Gen 6, they do this thing, and then people start going to jail, there's all these hearings, and that's sort of that's the selection on that group.
Well, yeah, I mean, January 6th, you have to put your foot down somewhere. Yeah. but for a lot of things, you know, example, Roe v. Wade getting repealed. Huge problem is that Texas is a huge area where abortion is going to be banned everywhere. Okay, well, what if you allowed some more heterogeneity? Well, maybe it would be legal in Austin. It probably would. Maybe it would be legal in Houston. And so it would be a much smaller problem actually, and for a lot of things. I mean, yeah, like you say, I mean, you don't want to allow everything, I suppose. Yes.
Well, just to stack on that, because when we had Nicole Crianza on the show, and she was talking about how cultural evolution proceeds faster when you balkanize, you know, so I mean, it is interesting. Like I was reading a piece on NPR just last night about the, you know, the way that this is, you know, every state is now its own laboratory about how to respond to this. So I think, but like your question, there is that thing about you can't have that kind of active coordination unless there's a superstructure that allows people to vote with their feet, right? Like in some sense, whether it's like through like digital communities or actually moving to another city. And I think there does seem to be a trend where like cities are like this is a city where chips are made now, you know, like this is like cities are kind of assuming their own specialized identities now because they're becoming destinations for particular, it's like subcultures or like affinity groups.
Right.
Yeah, I don't know.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think that's right. I mean, so you're,
But I don't know, I mean, it's just like but I mean, to Andre's point, like, then you're just reproducing the problem at another scale, right? Like, it doesn't, yeah, and you kind of said the same thing.
so you're saying there'd be, you know, a lot
There becomes a minority pocket of like these cities now, rather than these people are all politically aligned, and then they're existing within a larger, you know, like you've got a blue city and a red state, whereas before it was like 5 blue people in a red village or whatever.
I see. Well, wouldn't it be now there's like a blue state in a red country or something like that?
I don't know. I don't want to take up too much of this.
Okay.
But yeah.
So we can talk more.
Yeah.
Yes.
Taking to its logical extreme, doesn't that kind of like lead to a breakdown in society? Because it's like,
Oh, yeah.
okay, I disagree with like this group, and then we break off. Okay, we go our separate ways. Okay, well now I disagree with like this group, and we break off, and then now we're just a bunch of individuals.
Yeah, it's not usually, I guess you don't want to take it to its logical extreme. You want to allow some heterogeneity and to the extent possible. But yeah, I'm not advocating for extreme policies. I'm just saying that we have extreme homogeneity now, and maybe that's not so great.
Okay. So I guess when I think about it, it's weird that you have low visibility of like what people are doing, but then you can also have consciousness where you like basically know exactly what everyone's doing. To me, that's a bit like,
Right.
I feel like in real life, none of those defectors would say that they were defective.
Oh yeah, no.
So-
No, yeah, so to that, I would say that, people might have a sense for the size of the public pot because they can see, in general, how well is my community doing? How well are things taken care of? And so that's a proxy for how many people are cooperating. It doesn't require knowing who is cooperating and who's not. And I think that's a plausible thing to assume. I think, people can have a general sense for how their group is doing without knowing who specifically is doing what. And so, yeah, so my assumption here is that you can not know what individual people are doing, but you can know sort of on aggregate what's happening on a group level.
But what if you assume that they didn't know because they couldn't compare themselves to all the other communities? I don't know.
Well, then, yeah, I mean, if they didn't know, then yeah, you wouldn't. If they didn't have any knowledge of what was happening on a global level, then conscience wouldn't really make a lot of sense. Yeah. Yes.
So one thing that you're talking about is like, okay, you have a sense of that how well your local community is doing, but you don't know like individual reputations. And your assumption is that this inspires to also contribute and cooperate.
Yeah. Yes. Well, not my assumption really. I'm saying that's a possible policy that you could have.
It's a kind of a crucial element of your outcome, right? If because I can actually argue the other way around. Like I look around, I say, well, okay, this city is taken care of very well. Why should I contribute?
Yeah.
And in fact, I mean, if I compare my own country with the United States, it always strikes me that in my own country, at the individual level, the cooperation is less than at the group level, because we have a socialist type of system, and people have a tendency to say like, well, the government should take care of this.
Yeah.
And in the United States, it's the other way around almost. So
yeah,
I can see that if things go well in the group, it actually inspires not to defect.
Yeah, I mean, that's interesting. I mean, so like, I guess I'm not assuming that. My assumption is that this is a possible strategy. Then I ran these simulations to see if the strategy can actually be successful, like, because it could have just died out and never,
Sure.
it never had any impact, but it didn't. It generally the conscience agents made up about the 35% of the population, and so there is an assumption though at play, I suppose, which is that I didn't include the strategy that you just that you just mentioned, and yeah, I mean that could be something that I do in the future. I think that's an interesting idea. Mm-hmm.
And this is an extension off of that. I think that your model depends on your agents knowing what is cooperation, what is defection. That is, what kind of action contributes to the public good and what doesn't. That's not so clear if we're talking about red and blue, right? Because both red and blue believe that their way is the right way and better for society.
Yeah.
And so given that, and because at one point when you had your matrix, and there was you said there's some confusion on the part of the individual of whether cooperation is harmful or beneficial. And so, but it could be that I look around me, I'm a defector, and you would call me a defector. I just call myself, I'm not gonna, color. And I look around, I'm like, everything's awesome because I'm doing what I'm doing. And so I'm gonna internalize that.
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, I do think that there are a lot of cases, yeah, especially in like politics and things where it's not so clear what the pro-social thing to do is. And I think that comes from a lack of feedback about, the impacts that your views might have, which kind of goes back to my heterogeneity point, I think, because I think, it's because we have limited ability to see how our views actually change things, because things are happening on such a large scale. I think that's probably the main driver in people, not knowing what's good and bad for society. But I think people would have a lot better of an idea if there was more agency to actually act according to.
Well, and on this, I don't know if you all saw, maybe half a year ago, the Times reported on, so there was some population who could act on their Ayn Rand fantasy of, antisocial behavior. And there's these islands that are, do you all know what I'm talking about? There's islands that are, I think, part in some sense of the UK, but separate enough that they can have their own taxing scheme, which is zero tax. And so people are buying in, thinking this is really incredibly wonderful. And then they're realizing, wait, okay, we need fire, and then we need police, and then the kids got to go to school, and then some of us are getting sick. And so it's falling apart, but they were able to act on it.
That's interesting. Yeah. So hopefully those realizations will make them less extreme. But then I would also say that, in the world now, it's the most extreme people that are breaking off and doing stuff, right? And so we have maybe a negative perception of that because it's not everybody that's governing themselves. It's the most extreme that are breaking off and doing. So we do have like a sort of sampling bias type of thing where we're maybe not so receptive to that idea because we see crazies doing it only and not well-meaning people. Yes.
I think one thing that is interesting, I don't know how you're to deal with it with this conscience idea, but is what the ground truth is, like what the objective gestalt or whatever of the community is, and what you perceive it to be as an individual. So you mentioned extreme groups, or I'm thinking about Twitter is, I think, skews people towards cynicism and highlighting defecting, and people could have this belief that that is what their community is like, but actually people are much more reasonable face to face. So
Right.
this sort of slippage between your beliefs about the norms and your
Yeah.
beliefs about your own behavior
Yeah,
and what the actual ground truth is, I think, going to be important.
yeah, that's a really nice point. Yeah, I think some of it goes a little bit back to this like sort of information interaction disconnect, like where we have, like I know things online about people that I like never interact with. They're the first people that show up on my Instagram feed or whatever. And so there's these like funny sorts of like, concentrations of attention, right, that occur in these sort of large scale systems because certain people are getting all the eyes and then they can skew everything, like the perceptions. And so, yeah, I mean, I don't think that these particular models have much to say about that because they're, there's not this kind of, these particular models are sort of modeled off like smaller scale groups and things like that, not like society-wide like smaller scale interactions, I mean, rather than, distal perceptions of people and things. But yeah, no, I think that's a really interesting thing to think about. Yeah.
One possible problem with this idea of you try something out, you see how what the feedback is from reality and then adjust, is that feedback from reality is going to be interpreted through certain value lens. So if I'm a certain type, let's say I'm a really conservative Christian, and I look at my community and abortion's illegal and everyone goes to church every day, women are back in the household where they belong, taking care of large families of kids, my community's homogenous racially because we don't allow immigration. I could look at that and go, this is awesome, things are going great. Because in the context of my value system, these are all positive developments. So I don't know how you get the feedback working when how things are going really depends on your value lens.
Yeah, I mean, this is always a balance, right? Like, on the one hand, we want people to be able to, we want democracy in essence, like people have agency in the choices in the way that the community is run. On the other hand, we don't want people doing like egregiously bad things. And so.
But bad based on what, like
shared
liberal values, and then just assuming that blue values are the right ones.
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely a hard question. There's certainly some elements of objective feedback, like if your community is not able to eat or these types of things, or can't keep people safe or whatever. But yeah, I mean, with I think I'm not saying that we should let people do whatever they want. I'm just saying that maybe we want to allow for a little bit more heterogeneity than we have now. And yes, people might interpret the feedback that they get from their decisions differently depending on their value systems. I think that's better than no feedback at all.
Thank you very much.